So, as is our usual format for this hour-long fireside chat, for the first half hour, we're going to chat for a little while about mushrooms. And I'm joined by my friend Patrick Schultz, WSU Extension Forester. I'm going to share some of my own personal anecdotes for about 15 minutes, identifying specifically edible mushrooms in my family's forest, and then turn it over to Patrick to share some of his experiences running cultivation trials for mushrooms. So if you get skunked trying to find mushrooms out in the woods, you should be able to glean some useful intelligence from Patrick on how to grow your own in your backyard. And then for the second half hour, we're going to turn it over to you all, and I would love to hear your anecdotes about mushroom foraging. A few disclaimers. Of course, nobody should take anything that I say seriously or verbatim. Mushroom hunting is fraught with peril. If you misidentify something, you could end up in the hospital. So you want to make absolutely sure that you positively identify any mushroom that you find out there before you pop it in your mouth. So I don't want anybody running off from this fireside chat and foraging freely in the woods out there and then getting sick on me. So that's my disclaimer there. One thing that just a little anecdote before we get started. I've got two kids, and they've obviously been raised identifying everything that's edible in the forest, from berries to plants to mushrooms. And very early on, they developed an appreciation for what's edible and what's palatable. And when they were really young, it was kind of fun because we'd come across something, and I'd always ask them, "Okay, what is this?" It's kind of quiz. They'd have to identify it, and then they would pause for a moment, and they'd have to say, whether it was edible or just palatable. And so the mushrooms that I'm going to share with you, I'm not going to go to the common ones out there, the chanterelles and what have you. I'm going to kind of slide into the arcane a little bit. This is a great time to be looking for mushrooms out in the woods. I was out last weekend walking through my woods and found just an enormous variety of them. Most of them I had no idea what they were. I'm not in any way a professional mycologist. I'm not even an amateur mycologist, but just a tremendous diversity. And having found all these different mushrooms over the years, and looking them up to identify them, it's kind of surprising actually how many are considered edible. Again, not necessarily palatable, but at least edible. And so, there is a larder out there that may be filled with survival food, sort of your last resort if it comes down to it. But those are the mushrooms that I'm going to share with you now. Some of these, may or may not be familiar to you, and I'm going to share a few that are edible, a few that are medicinal, and then turn it over to Patrick. So with that, let's see here. I'm going to pop up a slideshow. All right. This is, I think, one of the most beautiful mushrooms in the woods out there. I rarely find it in much quantity. First of all, backing up, just so you understand the ecology of my forest, where these mushrooms occur. All of these, I believe all of these were found at my Oakville forest, which is a young 30-year-old Douglas fir alder stand, loamy clay soils, about 500 feet elevation, south-facing aspect. So certainly that ecological niche is going to inform, what kind of mushrooms grow there. So just for that, with context, this mushroom is called Lacaria amethystio, and we're going to play along here while I try to pronounce the Latin for each of these. It is edible, but apparently doesn't have much flavor. I think from my perspective, it's just beautiful to come across and get down and examine closely. Probably not something that I'm going to end up putting in the cook pot. Another Laccaria, and just one note on the Laccaria genus. Laccaria comes from the word lactose, and when you break these mushrooms, they weep kind of a white liquid like milk, and so that's one way to identify mushrooms that are in the Laccaria genus. This one, Laccaria laccata, same thing. It is edible and mild tasting. These usually grow in large clusters, little villages, I like to call them, and so those you can actually probably harvest enough of to get to warrant to actually cooking them up. Let's see. Another Laccaria. I couldn't figure out the actual species to this one. So again, just assuming the same thing. It is edible, mild tasting. And I'm hoping somebody or some buddies out there has more experience with mushrooms than I do. I believe this one is called the candy tuft mushroom, and I don't know if anybody can verify that. It's oftentimes used to make cookies because it imparts, I believe, kind of a pepperminty taste, which is an odd outcome of a mushroom, but or it fills the room with kind of a pepperminty scent. This is a beautiful one that I just saw last weekend, a bolete, the red cracking bolete, and I am not going to try to pronounce the Latin for that one. I tried several times practicing that and stumbled over it multiple times. This one, even though it's a bolete, apparently has a very bland flavor and not particularly palatable. And apparently you need to, when you harvest it, you need to scrape the gills off and cook it fairly quickly, as it has a very, very short shelf life. I think this is one of the most intriguing mushrooms out there. I actually stole this photo off the internet, even though I've found them out there. I couldn't find my photo of it. Cat's tongue mushroom, sometimes called jelly tooth. And these are really fun when you find them because you can just grab them, pop them in your mouth, and it's kind of like eating a gummy bear, except absolutely flavorless. So not entirely entertaining in that respect. But super interesting, odd mushroom. And again, they're very solo. You usually just find one like this popping up. So it's not one that I'm inclined to harvest too regularly, as I feel like I might be depleting the resource. The red-belted conch babies at two of their different life stages, when they're first emerging from a Douglas fir log, and then when they're a little bit older. Now we're shifting into medicinal mushrooms, and the next three are known for their antioxidant properties and their anti-cancer properties. This is a really common mushroom on Douglas fir that has been recently killed or recently cut down. I find this a lot in my woods. Reishi, Ganoderma. This was a beautiful find. Usually you see this growing out of a log or directly off of some type of wood. This was growing right out of the forest floor, as you can see. So there must have been some buried wood underneath it. And I have gone back to find this reishi for, probably 4 years now. And I think it's died off, but it's such a dense, hard conch that it just persists out there. I haven't seen it growing at all, but really cool to find a reishi in my young forest. Usually I feel that they're associated with older forests, old growth forests. Turkey tail mushroom, again, medicinal, similar to the past two, antioxidant, anti-cancer properties. Beautiful, beautiful mushroom, really common, also a very hard, dense mushroom, so not edible, something you'd be making tea out of or powdering to make a medicine out of. And I believe that is it. So like I said, I avoided some of the more common ones, the chanterelles, and I avoided chanterelles out of protest because despite being down in my woods for the past 3 weekends looking for them, I haven't found a single one yet. And last year, as a lot of people reported to me, chanterelles were, or it's just a poor mushroom year altogether. So I thought, well, this year it's going to be a bonanza. And apparently it's just not quite the right time yet. So I'm going to have to head down either this weekend or sometime next week and see if they're popping up. But no chanterelles. And then the other very common mushroom are oyster mushrooms that grow in alder that's decaying. Very common on my land and the hill where my land is. With that kind of short overview of some of the fantastic fungi in my woods, I want to turn it over to Patrick to talk about some of his cultivation trials through his work at WSU. And by way of introduction, if I had any other job, I would want to have Patrick's job. I mean, he spends all of his time with his feet up, daydreaming about ways to add value to forest resources. He's done maple syrup trials. He's done mushroom cultivation. He's an aficionado of agroforestry, forest farming, and that's what I thought I would always do with my career. But glad that Patrick is in there. He's a visionary, hard worker. I don't think you actually have your feet up all that often. But looking forward to hearing what you're up to out there, Patrick. What can you share with us?
Thanks, Kirk. That's a very kind introduction. And I'll say there's still time for you. We need you in forest farming. So, I'm really excited and happy to be invited and to talk about shiitakes, particularly. I'm going to share my screen real quick so you guys can get an idea. I did about the same thing that Kirk did, just threw some pictures on some slides. I've done more formal presentations on this, but I'd like to keep this casual. I'm gonna go full screen and then you'll have to tell me if you're seeing the right one.
Looks good.
Looks good. Okay, cool. Yeah, well, as Kirk mentioned, we've been doing some trials on growing shiitake or what we call log grown or log cultivation of shiitake for the last 3 or 4 years here at WSU Extension. And I don't want to take all the credit. This is actually a project that a colleague of mine, Justin O'Day, if anyone's down in Clark County, he's out of the Clark County office. He's really the PI on the project, but we've been partnering and I've been hosting satellite research trials for him for the last 4 years. And together we've really learned a lot about how shiitake can be produced in the Pacific Northwest. And for a little bit of background, this is a pretty common practice. Well, it's a really common practice in countries like Japan. And I was fortunate enough to go to Japan this year and study some of these methods. And I have some pictures from that as well. But in the 80s, they sort of adopted this practice in the US, but mostly in sort of the Southeast, Northeast, Midwest areas where you have a lot more hardwoods. This does require hardwoods for cultivation, so that's maybe why it took off in that part of the country a little more easily. It's a little more common over there, but really up until relatively recently, not common at all in the Pacific Northwest. But for no other reason than we just hadn't really done it before. And that's kind of how things are sometimes. It doesn't happen until you do it. So we decided to do some trials. We got a little bit of grant funding to do that. And I thought what I could do is just kind of run through the process, a general process of how you do this. If you wanted to do this at your own, on your own property, it's great for just home scale, just, doing a few logs, maybe 10 logs to produce enough shiitakes for you to eat. But a lot of the research we've been doing is looking at how landowners could actually make money doing this and farmers could make money doing this by utilizing their sort of marginal woodlots and stuff like that. So I'll talk just about the hobby scale, but if anybody is interested in a commercial scale, I would be happy to chat with them. All right, so I don't have any pictures of what it means, what it looks like to go out and collect the logs. I just have the logs all in the barn. This is what I was doing this spring. This is my whole inoculation setup. So as I said, you need hardwoods. You also need living hardwoods. A common misconception is that you can just go and get a log off the ground, pick it up, take it in, and inoculate it. That could be possible if the tree just fell in a storm or something like that. But really, once the tree's been out there for a little while, all kinds of the other mushrooms that Kirk was describing are already in there and competing. And remember, shiitake is not a native fungus, so it doesn't really outcompete. Well, in this case, it's a non-native fungus that doesn't outcompete native fungus, which is probably a good thing, really. And so we really are trying to give every advantage to shiitake when we're inoculating a log. That's how we should be thinking about it. Is how can we give the competitive edge to shiitake over all of these other native feral fungi, I like to call them. And you do that by selecting living logs to start, and you do that while the trees are dormant. And so we tend to think that we should be going out and cutting trees in like February, mid-February, before they start, just before buds swell is what's really important. Because once that sap starts flowing in the tree and the leaves are starting to pop out, you start to, the bark is easily sloughed off. The bark will fall off really easily. And that bark is really important for maintaining moisture in the log. And you'll see that one of the reasons that this has failed in the Pacific Northwest for many, many years, for many people that have tried it, is simply because we've not been able to keep moisture in the log during our hot, dry summers. So that's the second thing you really need to be thinking about is how can we keep moisture in the log? How can we give the competitive edge to shiitake? So back to the point, you're going out and you're harvesting the logs in mid-February, maybe late February. As long as you're doing it before the buds start to swell, you should be in good shape. You let the logs sit out there before you buck them up. You just let it sit out there, just fell the tree and let it sit for like, they say 3 to 4 weeks. We're a little unsure on this. And when we went to Japan, we really learned a lot. And we also got a lot more questions. That's just how it goes. But the idea is that you're letting the log, the antifungal properties in the tree die out. So you're waiting for the tree to properly die, basically, before you inoculate it. Because the theory is if you just went right away and inoculated it, the shiitake, it would still have some of that antifungal property, and the shiitake just wouldn't do as well. The tree would kind of fight it off, maybe. So you wait for a few weeks, then you buck them up. We tend to say 4-foot logs are best. And by the way, you want logs that are about 4 to 6 inches in diameter. So you can go bigger, but it's a lot. It's hard to haul around. It's really just a matter of weight. Any smaller, then they tend to dry out a little easier. So there's flexibility there, but 4 to 6 inches in diameter is ideal. And then we do 4-foot bolts, 4-foot length. Again, any longer, it's just really hard to haul around. You do have to haul these logs around a lot. And any smaller, you're starting to lose more moisture from the log, right? There's less interior of the log if you're making a shorter one. So that's what you see here. We have 4-foot bolts. I think there's like 48 of these in total. It's a mix of ash and Oregon ash and red alder. So far, red alder seems to be the workhorse. We really wanted big leaf maple to do well because it grows those coppices, those big bunch trees. It's like tons of small diameter wood that would be perfect for this. But we really found that it's not a very good species for us. We tend to see a really long spawn run. It takes a really long time, like 3 to 4 years before we get any mushrooms out of it. And who wants to wait 3 to 4 years? So we are trialing some other species like Oregon ash right now. I don't really know how it's going to do. We've also tried Oregon oak. Oregon oak does really well. The sweet cherry, which is not our native cherry, but it's like the feral one that you see kind of along the roadsides and stuff. That does pretty well. And then birch, if you have it, birch is amazing, paper birch, but it's not a terribly common species. So as far as species goes, tend to be ideal. And as I said, this is the inoculation setup. Inoculation is really quite simple. You are drilling a bunch of holes in it. You're filling those holes with shiitake spawn that you can buy from a supplier. And then you're waxing them over. So I'll show the steps right here. This is just a sawhorse that or what's that called? I think I messed that up. Sawhorse? Anyway, this is what I use. And then this is a modified angle grinder that has a little bit on it. And I think I've got a better picture of it right here. That drills the holes. And now this is really for more of a commercial scale thing. You could totally just use a cordless drill to do these. But if you're doing a lot of them, this thing can drill holes at 4 times the speed of a cordless drill. So it really is kind of a game saver. So this is what I use because we're dealing with kind of bigger numbers. And then you can see how I've kind of measured out the distance here. This is the space between the holes where you're filling with the spawn, and you can see how they're kind of offset, and that's because the lines are offset so that you create a diamond pattern like this. And this is the final product here. You see there's holes 3 to 4 inches in between, and then 3 to 4 inches in between rows as well. And so it creates this diamond pattern. And we're playing around with different densities of this. Theoretically, the shiitake actually works its way through the length of the log much easier than it does sideways. So it may be a way to save spawn by having a longer distance between the holes within the rows, but then maybe having tighter spacing between the rows. That's something that we're playing around with. So this is the inoculation station once you've drilled your holes. And this is just this whole thing is really cheap. That's what's the beauty of it. There's really not a lot of capital investment. I bought some caster wheels so that I can set the log on there, and then I can roll it along as I'm filling it. Again, if you're only doing a handful of logs, you don't even have to do all of this, but this was a really cheap setup. I've got my spawn here in the bucket. These are my inoculation tools because I'm using sawdust spawn. So you can use sawdust spawn or you can use plug spawn. And some of you have probably heard of the plugs. There's the little wooden dowels that you actually use a hammer to plug into the log. We haven't had as much luck with those. We feel they tend to dry out a little more quickly because they're hard to get flush with the log. And so they always stick out a little bit. And then it's hard to get those covered with a good layer of wax and keep them from desiccating. And then, they're no longer getting into the log. And even in Japan, we found that people that use the plugs, it takes longer for whatever reason, I don't know, to get a harvest out of them. It might take 2 years instead of 1 year. So I tend to go with sawdust spawn. And you can see a little bit of it right there. And it's just a bag of spawn you can dump into a bucket, and then you use one of these tools to plug it in. And you can see this is me doing this here. And I'm holding my phone with one hand and doing this, so you have to forgive me for the low quality. But the other part about sawdust spawn too is you get your bang for your buck. You get more out of it than the dowels. And then this is just a food grade wax. Some people use beeswax. I use the cheese wax. Really doesn't matter as long as it's food grade. And we've played with a lot of really expensive tools on how to apply this, but I don't have a video of this, but what I found is actually best is taking a metal turkey baster, clipping the nozzle off of it, and then using that. And then that was like a $10 fix, and we bought like $120 tools to try this, and they didn't work nearly as good as that. Also, just a spoon, just spooning it on there, because wax is pretty cheap. So you're using a small amount of logs, just use a spoon. All right, so once you're done, then you put them in the lay yard, is what it's called, for the spawn run. And this is just the period of time it takes for the shiitake to kind of inoculate the full length of the log. And Kirk, if I'm taking too much time, just stop me. I don't even know how long we're supposed to be doing this. But the spawn run is a period of time it takes for the shiitake to fully inoculate the log before you can start forcing it to fruit. And it should take about a year. Again, if other factors like poor inoculation, maybe you used a wider spacing at the holes, or the species wasn't very conducive, like using big leaf maple, it could take 2 years or maybe longer. But in an ideal scenario, within a year, you're able to harvest. And so that means cutting in the fall, inoculating in the spring, and then waiting a full year and starting to harvest in the following summer. So it takes a little bit of time investment, but ideally it's just a year, and then these logs will produce for multiple years. So in terms of the lay yard, though, where you want it in a nice shady place, which makes sense, right? You don't want a lot of sun exposure. You don't want a lot of wind exposure either. So we tried a bunch of different sites, and the difference between a site that had full sun for even just a couple hours of the day between a site that was fully shaded all day was remarkable. I mean, it was like two extra years of spawn run, way reduced yield. So you really want to make sure you're protecting these logs and taking care of them. And my theory is that hardwood shade is better than conifer shade, because the conifers, or the hardwoods, obviously they lose their leaves during the winter. So you're getting more sun exposure, but we don't have a lot of sun in the winter. We do get rain. And the conifers can actually prevent that rain from getting to the logs. And that winter recharge of rain, we found, is really important for putting moisture back in the logs ahead of the dry summers. So we really depend on that rain, and we want to do everything we can to protect them. On that note, another thing you can do when you have them in this is cover them in like some greenhouse fabric. We're doing that right now to just kind of mitigate, just during the summer, just trying to mitigate some of that moisture loss. You don't necessarily have to do that if you have them in a really nice shaded protected space. So you've waited a year, and now's the time to force fruit them. And there's a lot of different ways historically that we would force fruit, that people would force fruit logs. In Japan, they used to just hit them with a hammer. And that was actually something that they learned. One of the reasons they learned they could cultivate shiitake is because people noticed, or at least this is the myth, that after big thunderstorms, they would see more shiitake. And they thought that the rumbling of the thunder kind of was what caused the shiitake to force fruit. So people would hit them with a hammer, and that was a strategy for a long time. After a while, they found that soaking them for 24 hours in cool water, cool to cold water, is actually much more effective, and you get way better yields, even though it's kind of a pain in the butt. So compared to hitting them on a hammer. In our region, this is really important. It's not even an option to just hit them with a hammer, because again, this soaking them in these tanks or whatever you're going to use puts moisture back into the log, and that helps them live and continue to yield for multiple years. So because we just have these really dry summers that they don't have east of the Mississippi, we really are always thinking about how we can get moisture back in the log. And these these soaks that we do 2 to 3 times throughout the summer do a lot in the way of putting moisture back in the log. So you soak them for 24 hours. Again, I just use these livestock tanks, put a couple of 2x4s in there to keep them down. And then when you pull them out, you put them in an A-frame. And we found that if you happen to have that greenhouse fabric, and again, this is maybe more of a commercial scale thing, but what it does is it keeps the environment in there nice and humid. It protects them from winds, but it also protects them from pests. You pull them out, you put them in these A-frames, and then within a few days, you'll start to see little pinheads. Within a week, you should have close to fully formed mushrooms. And that's when the slugs come and they ruin your day. So you have to be really careful about slugs. This helps prevent those. There's also fungus gnats. There's other ways to protect from slugs. There's the slug pellets and stuff that you can use. But then just like a strip of copper around the base of it also works. But you will have to deal with pests. If you grow the shiitakes, the slugs will come for sure. So this is just another shot of the A-frame from the side, and you can't see it, but it's just 2 T-posts and a couple of 2x4s that I wrapped onto the T-posts with wire. So it's really nothing fancy. And then this is the harvest. This is what you get. Over the course of a summer, you can force fruit the logs about 3 times. Once you harvest, you put it back in the crib stack that you saw where they're crisscrossed, and then you let it sit for 7 weeks. and then you can harvest it again. So during the period where we have warm enough temperatures, where nighttime temperatures are above 45 or so, it just kind of equates out to about 3 harvests a year, and about, if you're doing right, everything goes well, about a pound per log per year. So I mean, that's plenty of shiitakes for me. If you grow, and if you happen to have like 10 of them, or 7 of them, say, you could soak 1 per week throughout the summer and always have shiitakes. At the hobby scale, that's definitely what I would be doing. So you want to pick them when they look kind of like this right here, when they're still curled under but not complete. Like this is a little unripe over here, but then if you can see these where their cap is fully extended out, these are a little overripe. And in Japan, they had different names for these, and they were different tiers of quality. But these mushrooms were the highest quality and had the best texture and flavor and stuff like that. And these are some other examples. This one, obviously, way overripe. It's hard to tell in the picture, but that thing is about the size of my face. It's just massive. And then I love this one because it's just the most perfect mushroom I think I've ever seen. I was really proud to have grown that. And then I thought I'd just show some pictures from Japan, and then I can answer questions if anybody has them. But really, I mean, when we went, it was just really, we quickly realized that this was a scale we would probably not ever achieve in the US. But partly because shiitake is just not as big a part of the culture here, but it was just so mind-blowing to see the scale. I mean, this was a research facility, so this wasn't even a commercial, and they had a ton of them. This was a commercial one. I think this one had 15,000 logs. And it's irrigated, so they would set it up on sprinkler systems. Japan is really humid, so they don't have to worry about all the moisture loss problems that we do, and they don't always soak their logs. Sometimes they just use these sprinklers to irrigate them and kind of jumpstart the fruiting process. Again, these are just more, and they would use giant ones. These were, I mean, that was like 10 inches across, and because they don't have to pick them up all the time, they're fine with using bigger ones. And that's not true for all the producers we went, but it was for this gentleman. Sometimes strangely enough, forest land can be scarce. They can easily get the logs, but they don't have forest land to put their logs under, and so they use these shade nets. And some people actually prefer the shade nets because you can control it a little bit more. And so we went to several of these tunnel houses, or whatever you want to call them. Again, 10,000 log operations, and just tons and tons of shiitake. Most of what they produced were dried shiitake. The fresh market is much smaller, but we did visit a few of those producers. But just, I mean, boxes and boxes of dried shiitake, all of them beautiful and have this like kind of cracked appearance that fetches like a really high price. That's my understanding. And yeah, just we had a really great time, and then we traded. I shouldn't say traded. We gifted back some maple syrup and then dried native mushrooms from Washington and Oregon, just to show these folks just how grateful we were for them to show us all that, especially in the rain, as you can see here. So, all right, that's what I have. And I'm happy to answer questions. That was a blitz, and I think
that was awesome.
More time than I thought I was going to.
No, that's great. Thanks, Patrick. That was a great overview. I already see where the points along the way where I failed in my process of producing shiitakes. One was using maple, and then not dunking them like that. So I'm going to share one anecdote where I was successful in growing shiitakes, and then we'll open it up for people either that share their anecdotes, foraging, and or ask either Patrick or I some questions. So my anecdote, and this is a while ago now, understanding the whole production process there of growing mushrooms and logs like that, I realized, man, that's a lot of labor. And so I came across this strategy of high stumping alder trees, where you cut them at 4 or 5 feet off the ground, but leave that stump intact. And the theory is that that stump continues to wick moisture up into it from the soil. So then I came along after cutting that tree, let it sit like Patrick said for several weeks, and then inoculated those alder stumps. And those alder stumps produced shiitakes for gosh, shoot, what was it now? I believe it's I believe it's 3 years, and there were 2 flushes a year out of that. And so I wasn't able to compare, production rates. They may have been, a lower production than the more meticulous process that Patrick illustrated there. But from a labor saving standpoint, and one of the ahas that I had was if you're going into a young alder stand and pre-commercially thinning, as long as the average diameter of the alder, are that 4 to 6 inches that Patrick said, here's a great opportunity to PCT your stand and then inoculate the residual stumps, get some shiitakes out of that while the residual alder continue to grow up to a merchantable log size. So that's my one shiitake anecdote.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'd had a very similar thought, and I'm glad to see that it worked out. I'll say that would be best for cold weather shiitake strains. I didn't explain this, but there's 3 different strains. There's cold weather, warm weather, and wide range, and it just refers to the temperatures under which they like to fruit. But the cold weather does best on the marginal seasons. So I was wondering, were your flushes like kind of when we would get native mushroom flushes, like in the spring and the fall?
That's what I recall. Yep.
Yeah, so that would be a great system for that. That would make a lot of sense.
Okay, well, we've got a few things we can do here. Looks like some questions may have come in the chat, so maybe we should start with some questions and then open it up for a free-for-all. People can ask questions directly, or again, I would really love to hear from you all, specifically where your favorite mushroom patches are, and what your experience has been, this year or historically foraging for mushrooms. So, Alex, do you want to check the chat first and see what kind of questions we have?
Yeah, Mark found what he thinks is a chicken of the woods. Do you know what they look like? And even if we think we know what they look like, I recommend still going to like a mycological society. They have these like ID clinics you can bring your mushrooms to get them ID'd. But assuming it is a chicken of the woods, are they good to fry? Does anyone worked with chicken of the woods mushrooms?
Yeah, I found them out there, but I've never harvested or cooked them, so I'll defer to anybody else who has experience.
I've heard they're good to fry. I've not done it myself.
Fried chicken of the woods. Okay, well maybe the internet will have to be the answer for that one, Mark.
Just speaking of that, I meant to mention some resources at the beginning of this. For those of you that are on Facebook, of course, there are innumerable Pacific Northwest mushroom foraging groups on Facebook. And I found that to be a really valuable resource. I'll post a photo of a mushroom I found and ask people what it is and get responses. If you do that, what I found is very important is that you get a photo both of the top of the mushroom and then also the underside or the gills, because whether a mushroom has gills or a spore surface is really important to identifying it. The other thing that I just found, and this doesn't surprise me, is, of course, there's an app for it. There are like at least three different mushroom identification apps out there. One I came across, you do have to pay a subscription, but kind of like the Plant ID app, you can take a picture of a mushroom and then it will identify it. Another one takes you through kind of a keyed process. What color is it? Does it have gills? What size is it? What color are the gills or the stem, etc.? And then shows you the range of options based on those criteria. And I found that latter one, which is free, to be very accurate. So for those of you that want to take it upon yourself, there's some options there.
Scott, it looked like you just unmuted yourself. So
I don't know if you can
see,
but David Aurora wrote a really fun book called All That the Rain Promises and More. And I highly recommend it because it's hilarious. It fits in your pocket. And I just looked up the sulfur shelf, also known as chicken of the woods, and he recommends cooking it thoroughly. And he said, if you do not serve it to lawyers, landlords, employers, policemen, pit bull owners, or others whose goodwill you cherish. So he didn't say whether frying it was the way to go. But anyway, this book, I highly recommend it. It's hilarious and very informative.
Can you repeat the title, Scott?
Yeah, All That the Rain Promises and More by David and Aurora is Aurora, who also wrote a very thorough, lengthy tome on mushrooms that is also excellent. So,
Great. Thanks, Scott.
sure.
Okay, so let's see. Bob asked any species preference for shiitakes, and I think this was for Patrick. And you did kind of talk about this, Patrick, but Bob also asked for lion's mane and oyster mushrooms.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I didn't do any trials on lion's mane or oyster. Justin, the colleague I mentioned, did. And he gave up on them pretty quickly from a cultivation perspective because they just weren't very reliably yielding in a way, not in a way that shiitake was, at least. So I think he was using alder though. And I would say, I mean, just based off my experience of what grows in the wild, at least for oysters, alder would be, probably the preference.
That's what I find it most commonly on. And I've found that wherever you have alder that's recently fallen and died, whether you've cut it or it's blown over, oyster mushrooms are pretty ubiquitous. So they seem to colonize alder very readily. I haven't tried intentionally inoculating also, just because I always find it in my alder stands.
Martin asked if you girdled the stumps, Kirk, or did they die? Or you were PCTing, you said?
Yeah. No,
Okay.
I didn't girdle them, didn't do anything else to intentionally knock back, say, the immune system of the stump. This is so long ago now, and I wasn't keeping meticulous records at the time, but I used both plug spawn that Patrick mentioned. Then I also cut wedges into the stumps and packed them with sawdust, and I don't remember which method had more success. So that's kind of useless information for everybody.
Well, so on that note, Kid asked, where did you get your spawn, Patrick? Fungi perfecti?
So we trialed multiple different spawns. Fungi perfecti was one of them. It did not do very well, but it was, I think, due to a miscommunication about what kind of spawn it was. They had said it was a wide range, which is conducive to soaking and force fruiting, but we think it's actually a cold strain, which just fruits on its own, like Kirk was describing, when in the early spring and like late fall when it gets the natural rains. So I think that it is a fine species for the method that Kirk is describing, or a fine strain. But I go to Field and Forest Products. It's a company out of Wisconsin, and they have 8 or 9 different shiitake species or strains, and they have different color patterns and stuff, and different spawn run rates, and there's lots of really cool stuff to get there, as well as the tools. It's a great website. As an extension person, I'm not supposed to give preference to any private company, but they're the only ones doing it, so I don't feel really bad about it.
Martin, tell us about your shaggy parasols.
Yeah, hi. We just found a lot of these in our forests. This week we were just hiking around and ID'd them. We've seen them here in years past as well. They seem to be growing near cedars. We have cedar, Doug fir, hemlock, and alder in our forest, and they seem to be growing nearest the cedars. And they were great. There's a lookalike that you can tell that it has a different color spore print, but some other characteristics are that there's a veil around the stem and that they stain like orange. So you can see where the stems are cut. It's really dark. And yeah,
Is shaggy parasol the same as shaggy mane, or are those two different?
I think they're different. But we use the same David Aurora book to ID these. It has really good keys for IDing. It's really well done and concise for just the mushrooms that are relevant to the Northwest and not every mushroom species known to man. And then it tells you about some of the characteristics of the lookalikes that you might want to make sure that it's not.
What do they taste like?
They're really good. I'd say they're similar to oysters, or they have a really mushroomy flavor. We made a big leek potato soup and added them to that.
Yeah, my little sister is vegetarian and she was really wanting clam chowder because she just moved here to the Pacific Northwest from the Midwest. And instead we made a mushroom chowder and it was really good. We just used shaggy parasols that we foraged earlier that day. And they cook down to like nothing. So they look giant, just like that picture. Is that our picture?
Yeah,
that's our picture. Okay. But like when you cook that whole basket, it just really like they just go right down into it fits into like a half a cup.
Yeah, I kind of broke the stems off and then I started cutting them and I ended up just breaking them apart with my hands and then sauteed them in a little oil for probably 5 or 10 minutes and they lose a lot of moisture and get really soft and then we added them to the soup.
Yeah, and these mushrooms in particular, like we just noticed that they came in a flush. So I know a lot of mushrooms do that, but like really these were everywhere over the course of like 2 to 3 days. They were just like very plentiful and then nowhere to be seen. So
Very cool. That is a big basket. It's very impressive. Let's see. Okay, so we had a question from Alan with the alder stumps that you left, Kirk. Did they send up shoots eventually?
No, they didn't. I know that can be pretty common with alder. I suspect that they were old enough that they didn't sprout. I found that younger alder, smaller diameter alder can oftentimes sprout from the either the base or from the cut point. But these didn't for some reason. They may have just been old enough, large enough that they weren't conducive to that.
Scott asked, is there a tool that most of us might already have to insert the sawdust spawn in the drilled holes, Patrick?
Probably not. I mean, it is a simple tool. It's just a little hollow tube with a spring that shoves it in, but it is kind of unique to the process. The good news is it's really cheap. It's like maybe $25 from Field and Forest Products.
And then what diameter were the holes drilled?
Ooh, I'd have to get back to you on that. I don't remember what the bit size is. Yeah, half-inch maybe? I shouldn't say anything. I'm not sure.
Well, we can share out the website for there's like a web page at least for this project with
No, there needs to be.
Okay.
It's
Okay.
in process.
Okay.
But I know Kit who has that. We can we can chat later.
Well, that was it for the questions that came in through chat. So if people just want to jump in and turn on their mics.
Is anybody foraging out there? What are you finding if you are? No, but right after this, you're going to go straight out and forage tomorrow. That's what I'm not hearing.
Oh, I got chanterelles about 10 days ago, right off the pavement on Rosedale Street.
I'm jealous.
That's
We-
all there were. I keep looking and there are no more.
I was going to say that could be a selling point for the workshop at your forest this weekend, Kit.
Right.
We found chicken of the woods and cauliflower mushroom this week. No chanterelles here yet in Brennan.
Okay.
Yeah, I got very few chanterelles out in western Clallam County, which surprised me because typically by this time of the year, there's enormous quantities of them. But they haven't had as much rain as they do in a normal year. So I think it's going to be slow. And last year, the chanterelle harvest was very meager. So let's hope that changes.
Same here.
I'd like to ask, are there any areas that are restricted from harvesting chanterelles, state land or federal land, Indian tribal lands? And has there ever been any quota put on the amount of chanterelles that can be taken? I was a native plant steward up in Washington and gave a talk on what native plant alliances were most likely to give particular mushroom species. And then we went up to Rainier National Park, and an Asian gentleman came out with a bag of chanterelles. I don't know how long he'd been there, but it was a 55-gallon bag. And it was bigger than he had it packed, as big as he could. And I always wondered from that is, it wouldn't take too many harvesters of that magnitude to wipe out a forest.
Yeah, I've wondered about that, the sustainable harvesting of mushrooms. But what I've always heard in response to that is, of course, the mushroom you see is just the fruiting body of a much vaster underground organism, and so you're not depleting the resources of that organism. Since it doesn't obviously need to flower or reproduce itself necessarily from its fruiting bodies. That the takeaway I've had is, you can harvest almost to your heart's content and not deplete that resource. But to your earlier question, yeah, I don't know if there are any harvest limits. Is there a catch limit for chanterelles off of federal lands? I've never heard that.
Just looked online, and the U.S. Forest Service for the Pacific Northwest has a 5-gallon limit for collectors, and you need a permit if you want to collect more than 5 gallons.
There we go.
Kirk, the analogy that I had heard was thinking that you'll eliminate or that you'll harm the mushrooms by picking them is like thinking you can eradicate blackberry vines by picking the berries.
That's a great analogy. Clearly that doesn't work.
If only.
I've actually heard it suggested that picking the fruit can actually stimulate growth. I don't know if that's true. I never really followed up with any research, but yeah, it's an interesting conversation.
Has anyone here made use of any of these mycological societies ID clinics? Like to bring their mushrooms to be ID'd?
Many years ago when I still lived in Seattle.
I tell one of my anecdotes from Weyerhaeuser in Washington State. Well, even here in Oregon, I think the loggers took great exception to the snowy owl. And one of the things they found after research was that actually for Doug fir, the mycorrhizal fungi that grows on their roots is eaten by the squirrels. The squirrels inoculate the forest in their passage through the treetops. And the snowy owl couple to rear a clutch in a year needs about 47 square miles of squirrel habitat. And they actually keep the squirrels in check. So the relationship was snowy owls actually made for much more healthy forests. Everybody loves mushrooms.
Well, that's a great anecdote to end on, Alex. You brought us across the 8:30 finish line, so thank you. Well, folks, out of respect for everybody's evenings, thank you for joining us again for another Fireside Chat, and you all are welcome back next month. I don't know what the topic's going to be, but we'll figure that out between here and there. Thank you again to Patrick for sharing your experience cultivating shiitakes. Thank you again, Alex, for everything you've done to support this Fireside Chat series, and we're going to miss you, but happy adventures out there. Thanks, folks, and hope to see you all next month.